Got my notes. Hold on, look at my notes.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's that time in life when I need these. I'm Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are joining us for the first time this evening? Oh, wow. Okay, great. A bunch of you have been here before, and those of you who haven't, welcome. We're the only nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, our first novel prize, and our emerging writing fellowship, to name a few ways. Please follow us on social media and sign up for our mailing list so you don't miss future mind-blowingly awesome events like the one we're having tonight. Just for example, we are hosting Jasmine Ward for the launch of her new book on October 24th with Ta-Nehisi Coates at the Town Hall. So, and that's just another of a bunch of really good stuff. So please come back and see us. A few housekeeping announcements. Our cafe and bar will be serving until 8:30. And we encourage you to drink. You can bring them in here. And we will have an audience Q&A this evening. When it's time to go to questions, if you're here in the room, please raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you. And if you're watching on the live stream, you can type your question in the chat at any time. And when the event is over, the books are for sale at the bookstore counter, and you can come back in here and line up to get them personalized. All right, now for our guest. Kiese Laymon is a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. He is the author of the award-winning memoir Heavy, the essay collection How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and the novel Long Division. Ayana Mathis's first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was a New York Times bestseller, an NPR Best Book of 2013, a second selection for Oprah's Book Club 2.0, the second selection, and has been translated into 16 languages. Her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Guernica, and Rolling Stone. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, born in Philadelphia and currently here in New York City, where she teaches writing at Hunter College's MFA program. Congratulations on the Unsettled, Ayana. Please welcome them to the stage.
What side you want? What side you want to sit on?
Hi.
Oh my goodness, what's up, y'all? How y'all doing? I'm so happy to be here. How you feeling?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be with you all day. I was making jokes. I was to my lovely partners back there taking pictures all day. I kept bursting in and going, "No one's coming to my launch. No one's coming to my launch."
and I was so lucky to be asked to do this. The person who asked me via you should tell you the sound I made when they asked. And let me just start this by saying, I feel incredibly lucky, and I want to start in a place I didn't tell you I would start, so I hope it's okay. Mm-hmm. So, I feel like we really met at Tin House.
Yes.
And Alexander Chi was there with us. This is Ayana's story, so it's going to connect to the book in a second. Some of us had never been to Tin House. Some of us hadn't stayed in a dormitory for 20, 30, some people 60 years. That first night, they put those paper sheets, the paper fitted sheet, then they put the paper fitted, they had paper sheet on top of us. Mm-hmm. And then one of the people who was there teaching with us, who was an OG, who we all respected, when they showered, they just filled the shower with hair. And there was one shower that we all had to share.
Such a situation.
So we walked, but we're teaching and shit, and in the morning, I remember I went to take a shower, and I just ain't never sat in like a half an inch of white people hair before, right? So all of the folks of color, particularly black people, we start talking. How we gonna do this, y'all? I don't know. Well, I guess we're gonna have to just suck it up and take it. Meanwhile, Ayana's over there ain't saying shit, right? Later that night, we in the dorm. Yo, let's go talk to Ayana. Ayana had gotten a suite across the campus. I said, fuck this shit. Like, I've been through too much to put my feet in a half an inch of water with a white woman's hair who I don't really know. And that was it. And we were so afraid to speak to you because you were Ayana Mathis, but that move affirmed your G-ness. And then when you came back,
or my obnoxiousness. I don't know which one.
Shit, we want, and then all of us were started to, we went to talk to Lance and tried to talk Lance, is there another place we could sleep? And he was like, oh, you mean the Ayana suite? And then they were like, say less. So anyway, we all came knowing you were legend, and you became legendary by refusing to sleep in situations that were beneath you, and we were very thankful. And what else happened at that week, y'all, was that we heard Ayana read from what would become the Unsettled. And it was one of those situations at this place where it's a lot of people who folks say can write, and I remember listening. I remember Alex listening. There were some other people, and I was just like, "Yo, what? How are we gonna read the rest of the week? It's impossible." And the wonder of you is that so little of that dynamic reading actually made it into this book. And so I wonder, instead of talking about what people want to talk about, like the time it took, I wonder if you can talk about the various manifestations of the setting of this book. From beginning to end, before we get into the actual text.
Early on, there's a sort of a birth sequence of one of the main characters named Ava, and it takes place in Natchez, Mississippi, and somehow it sort of didn't make it into the final cut somehow. Right. But what did make it in, which I had a fairly strong sense about, was Alabama. So there's a fictional town in the novel called Bonaparte, and it's on a bend in the Alabama River, and it's very loosely modeled after an extant place called Gee's Bend, which if people know of, they'll know of it from the quilts that come from there. Very famous. There are a couple of them in the Smithsonian, and then also just kind of independent Black communities that sprung up all over the South, particularly during the Reconstruction, many of which don't exist anymore. Right. So that Bonaparte place was very clear, and it was very clear both in terms of the fact that would be where Duchess, another of the main characters in the book, lives. It was very clear also that there would be this question of land that was being lost, that was being taken, that was being stolen, and how these Black people who found this town and have lived there for over 100 years at this point, that not just that their livelihood, but their entire legacy and their history is being threatened because the land is disappearing. So when the book opens, this had once been a very thriving place. They were sort of operated cooperatively. They had preserves and pickles and all kinds of things that they sold. They sold furniture. When the book opens, there are 5 of them left, 5 very old people left. All the young people have gone, trying to sort of hold this place down and to save it from the encroachment of various threats, white developers, state violences of various sorts. So that place was very, very clear. The other place, the other sort of pole in the novel is Philadelphia. When the novel opens, we are in the 2 main characters. There's 3. So there's Duchess, who is the mother of a woman named Ava, and her son, Toussaint, who's about 10, 11 when we meet him. They're in a homeless shelter. And they're in a homeless shelter for families and children, and it's the 1980s. And that place also was very clear. Well, I should say, I don't know that I can say that it was very clear. I knew that that's where it needed to be, but I had a lot of trouble, and it took many, many, many years for me to write that place, in part because some of that history is my own history. And so in some ways, it became, there was a long process that took several years of separating whatever flat memories I may have had about things from something that is a narrative. But like snapshots are not narrative, right? They're just these static things. They're flat. They don't do anything. They don't mean anything. And so there had to be this process by which that flatness could become story, could become dynamic, could become setting that is as integral as, say, Bonaparte is to the novel, right? So like a living thing that sort of is a vessel for these people at the same time that it is acting on them. Absolutely. So that was a very long process, and I don't know. I'm not even sure sort of how it happened. It took a long time, and at a certain point, I think it probably had something to do with the development of Ava as a character. As she became clearer to me, then it became easier to sort of be like, okay, well, this is a human being that I need to move around this place. So how does she interact with this place? Right. What does she think of this place? What does her son think of this place? What does it do to them? How does it act on them?
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that I was really wanted to ask, even after your first book, was this idea of point of view. This is tied into what you just said. You know, a lot of us who teach your work teach you as one of the like magicians of POV. And I mean, right? Yeah. Like there's something supernatural happening, I think, with the way you manipulate POV. And one of the questions I always wondered about your work is, like, if that was my superpower, like, I'm so desperate. I'm pulling that motherfucker out every book, right? Like, I'm going to make this, you know, most polyphonic, multi-narrative. But with this book, did you know you needed different POVs coming in, and or did the place and settings like demand so many different switches in POV?
I kind of wanted it to. I wish that it had more POVs. Like I'm way more comfortable with like a lot of people,
right?
And then when I can sort of leap between their consciousnesses, then it was very difficult for me to kind of. I mean, there are multiple POVs, but there are essentially three main POVs, right? Which are Duchess, who's, you know, in this town Bonaparte, who's this kind of brash woman, who's very wise, but also. Someone called her profane, which I really liked.
Saw that.
Right? I thought that was really good. And she is, you know, and then there's Ava, her daughter, who's in Philadelphia, and Toussaint the son. And so those are essentially the main voices. And honestly, it was a little difficult for me to mostly keep myself to those voices, because I just. You know, I figured out a long time ago that I wasn't a short story writer, and the way I figured it out is because I would try to write a short story, and I'd be like, "But what about the uncle? And what about the guy that lives down the block?
Yeah.
And what about this? And what about that?" Yeah. And so I was like, "Okay, I'm not. You know, that is not my." So there was this process of kind of whittling back a little bit, because there were a few more voices than actually appear.
Right.
In the first section, particularly when they're in the shelter. It's tricky material, right? Because it's, well, first of all, it's probably a fictional setting that people don't really necessarily come to with a sense of what it is already, right? Mm-hmm. Like there are many different settings in which you might put a group of characters, and it would be they would ring a bell somehow, right? So for many readers, that doesn't necessarily ring a bell. Right. So that means that that I in order to make it more real and more kind of nuanced and more dynamic, I could have Ava and Toussaint and their feelings about it, but I also needed some other voices to kind of like give it more texture and sort of make it a fuller, more real sort of place. Yeah. And then of course their perspectives are very important because they're having two very different experiences of being in that place. Right. But for me, you know, point of view is. I think I used to get really hung up on some notion that you had to, like, I don't know, be fair or something about people. Right? Like, it's just like, well, these people get a turn to speak, and then these people get a turn to speak, and then, you know, whatever. Right. Like, that sort of thing. When in actuality, I think the conclusion I've come to is that whoever needs to speak, speaks.
Needs to speak.
And then I just sort of deal with it and kind of clean up the mess afterwards.
Yeah. And you know, I think I want to talk the 30 minutes we have left about Abe and Toussaint and their relationship, and I also want to get back to like spatially what you did, and with those two characters. But I also think in a weird way, it's hard to understand any of who they are without talking about Duchess and Cass. But I want to start with Duchess, if it's okay, and ask you how and if you hear Duchess speaking to you now that the book is closed. because that is a wonderfully haunting character to me. And I have another question about that, but I wonder, do you still feel and hear that character? I mean, that assumes that these characters. Let me ask you, do your characters talk to you? I should assume that. I shouldn't assume that.
She kind of did.
Right.
Ava didn't. Ava, well, I know we'll talk about her in a minute, but she and I just had so many problems. Right. We did not get along. She was like elusive. I think she was mad at me because I judged her so much.
Right,
so then she didn't want to cooperate because I was like, you're a bad mother and you suck. And she was like, well, then I'm not going to show up for your book.
Right.
But Duchess, on the other hand, I think, she was a gift.
Yeah.
She was a gift. She kind of came as she was. That's how she sounded. Right. That's who she was. I didn't know exactly where she belonged just yet. You know, like I had to. That came later on. But that voice and that sensibility, that was very, very early on in what ended up being like an 8-year process. She just she came somewhere around year 6 and just kind of hung around.
And Cass, I mean, we could talk forever about Cass.
I know.
And so I think Cass could be like the connection to get us back to Ava. But was Cass a similar character in terms of like just I came as he was, or was Cass like some way to get Ava to move through a kind of utopic possibility?
He, a little bit both. I mean, I knew that I was interested in a villain. Because I think villains are really cool, and I don't know I've ever really sort of quite had one. But then the problem when you start writing a villain is that you're like, I think you might be a person.
Right.
So, I guess you have to have some person-like qualities, you know. So he got more complicated, and also he becomes he's pivotal. I'm like trying to avoid spoilers. I'm like,
I'm trying to too.
He becomes very important in establishing a utopic community. I can say that without too many spoilers. And this community, it's a black community. It's a black community that's very interested in liberation. Yeah. And I wanted him to be a character who was right about a lot of things, which in fact he is right about a lot of things. He's right a lot about threats against black people. He's right about autonomy. He's right about the need to have economic freedom. He's a doctor, and so he also he starts a kind of a free clinic. He's right about the need for better health. You know, he's right about all this stuff, but he's also a pretty diabolical guy. Yeah. So his methods are not so great, to say the least. So he ends up being really complicated, and the longer I spent with him, and the longer I spent with Ava, actually, understanding her reactions to him, the more I realized that, well, if she's complicated, then for her to have this kind of incredibly outsized reaction to this person, then he has to be complicated too.
Absolutely. And Ava is a character that I want to talk about. The texture, again, the way you move this character through space, I think is not just like wonderful, but also like radically important for what's happening in the literature today. Maybe we can come back to that later. But I wonder if we can talk about, I didn't ask if I could ask this either, but fear. Like, was there any fear in the way Ava would interact with this world once she jumped off the page? Like, did you have any fear about writing Ava with the particular contours that she did? Like, Ava puts us through a lot, right? You said she put you through a lot. And for some of us who know Ava sort of well, right? There's a fear, I think, sometimes in putting that character out into the world, because that character and those characters like her are often interiorly diminished. And I wonder if you felt any fear in putting that character out in the world, because I'm trying not to give spoilers, that's what I'm talking around it, but can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think she's difficult. She's really, really difficult. And Hattie too, from the first book, was also really difficult. So I guess I'd like these difficult women. And I think I'm also really interested in notions of motherhood that don't particularly jibe with the way that we think about mothers usually, right? Like she's she's not great at being a mom, and she knows, she at some point she's just like, I'm like not managing this very well, and I wish I could just not manage it at all. Like if I could, I would just kind of go off and do something else, basically. But she loves her son, so she's not going to do that. But I'm really interested in the ways in which, like what a bad mother is, or a failed mother.
Right.
Because I think lots of people have failed mothers, right? And I think also the definitions of what would be a good mother, I think it's a little bit it's very narrow.
Yeah.
It's like extraordinarily narrow. And it's narrow, it sort of alienates everyone.
Yeah.
And I think in particular for Black women and Black people, this notion of like what a mother looks like, what a mother's love looks like, is sometimes not, is never what it looks like in the Hallmark commercial, right? I mean, nobody's love looks like what it looks like in the Hallmark commercial, but I think like sort of pushing against those things, particularly, and also I always, probably because that is where I come from and what I'm most interested in, most proud of, like I'm always writing about poor women.
Yeah.
So the ways in which a poor woman might mother, and I mean, and that's even that is a generalization, but so forgive me for speaking in terms that are, I think, a little bit too generalizing and broad, but the options that person might have, both because their possibilities might be economically curtailed, and also because they might be approaching the world in a totally different way, right? Like I'm not making a victim story here where it's like, oh, poor women can't do this because they don't have any money. Sure, sort of, but also maybe people are looking at life in a different way. Maybe they have a different set of values. Maybe what they place value or importance on is different. And so that, I'm not even sure if I'm answering your question, but
definitely
to sort of bring it, I guess, back to Ava, is that I was very interested in creating this mother, and also Duchess is not really a very conventional mother either, both of them are, but so I was interested in kind of pushing against these ideas of like what a mother should be, what she looks like, how she's supposed to be. And I was interested in doing that through race, of course, through personality. These people have very big, distinct personalities and psychologies, and then also through class. Like that's really important. That and I think that these people exist on a margin, but I think they've chosen the margin. Right. Like it hasn't been foisted on them. They've made a decision about where to position themselves in life, and their values and etc. are kind of in accordance with those choices.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things you do in this book that you also did in 12 Tribes is I often wonder when I'm writing characters or people who know poverty extremely well, what the bargain I'm making with the readerly public is, right? Because I'm bringing readers into a space, while I purport to be someone who's not, trying to do like, this is native informant literature. But I wonder, is there any way to avoid native informant literature given the readership of this nation and this place when writing about people who so severely lack not personality, not ethics, but the foundational shit that the nation said they would give people? Do you feel there's any sort of tension in exploring that world with richness and in some way sharing it with the world that is not peopled by those folk? A readerly world. Yeah. Not the world. The world is.
Yeah. The readerly world.
Ain't caught up.
Yeah, got you. I do. I mean, it's the same. It's the other side of the coin of like, are you writing like pain porn in some ways, right? Like these are similar questions, right? Are you creating characters that are pain bodies, or that are going to be received as pain bodies? And I mean, there is that fear always, and there is that tension always. What I hope, I have no idea if I've succeeded. I can, my sense is that I can only be responsible to the extent to which I love these people. Yeah. And I love people like them. That's a great idea. And I am and was myself that person. Yes. And so if I love them, then that doesn't mean that I make them perfect. It doesn't even necessarily mean that I make them likable, right? Like granting part of the problem is that we don't grant humanity to people who are poor or people who are whatever, you know? And part of that not granting of humanity is making them all like noble or something. You know, I mean, I know plenty of poor people who are assholes, right? Do you know what I mean? Just because they are, you know, just like there's plenty of all kinds of people who are dreadful people, you know? So it doesn't mean making them perfect. It doesn't mean necessarily making them likable. It doesn't mean but it means making them, it means that the default, because I love them, is that they're human.
Yes.
And they're fully fleshed out, I hope. That is always my attempt, to make them as fully fleshed out, flaws and all, as I can. And that's all I can be responsible to and for. How that is received, I can't, you know, I can't do anything about that.
I love that.
I can just do my part, which is love.
Damn, that's good. and you know what? Like I've been seeing people write about this book in a lot of different ways so far, but one of the connecting tissues, I think, of some of the early reviews or critiques or conversations is this notion of like the time it took. But I just want to just kind of sort of, I just want to say thank you for taking as long as you took, or as short of a time as you took, to give us something so rich. And so I feel like this book came out sort of, in my estimation, before time started to appear to go super fast. A lot of fucked up shit happened in the world to all of us. We have run past this notion of grief and located ourselves in this idea of healing. So I'm wondering what you do with the movement and the changes that we see in the nation, particularly to Black people and really to Black poor people. Because no matter what the fuck we say, I mean, there's an assault on Black poor people, and it is pernicious always, but it changes. So I'm wondering, like, from the time this idea of a book came into your mind to the time you felt like it was ready to be out, can you talk about the way the world impacted the process and the community?
Well, it slowed it down. That's the obvious.
It slowed it down.
It did enormously. I mean, all
That's
you know,
huge.
the Trump years and the height. I was about to say the pandemic years, like they're over, but anyway, you know, whatever the height of, I guess. That was really rough going. It was very slow. Sometimes I couldn't. It felt futile. Like often, I was just like, why? I should just, like, why am I not like an EMT or a something? Like, what is all this sitting around in your honey? Like, what is that? You know? It seemed really stupid and like self-indulgent.
Really?
And then also just didn't even have the concentration sometimes. So it definitely slowed it down. But then, you know, in 2020, you know, like after George Floyd, when everything was happening and all the protests, and then I still was sort of feeling like, oh God, okay. But I started to think like, well, what is the, if I don't feel like this has any purpose right now, like if I feel like if I look outside or I go to a march and I feel like what has purpose is these people marching in the streets, like this is what has purpose. So I can do some of that, but I'm also not an activist, right? Like this is like, what do I do? And so I started to think, well, okay, is there some sort of companion purpose that I can find here? And I was reading James Baldwin, who always has the answers to everything. And what I started to think was that, okay, well, maybe this isn't super useful in this moment, but maybe it will be. So maybe what I am and what we are archivists. We make an archive. Like maybe that's what it is. We record things as they are, as we understand them in some kind of way. And when it is time, because the one thing that we know is that things will change, right? Nothing's never going to stay the same. At some point, it will be time. And when it is time, there will be this archive. And people can go back and say, well, that's how this was, and this is how they processed it, and this is what, just like we've been doing all along with every book that we've ever read, right? So and that made it easier to continue if I could think, okay, well, maybe not now, but maybe at some point, this is useful to somebody.
Yes. growing up in Mississippi, my grandmama used to always use this idea. I mean, I'm from Mississippi, so everything like wise I always get to my grandmama, but sometimes I realize the whole world says that shit. So I was about to be like, my grandma used to say this thing called you buy yourself time. And I'm like,
You're like, wait a minute.
every month, right? But she did, and I thought she was the only person. But I'm interested in not the time it took wonderfully for you to create this book, but the way you deal with time, space, and region. And when writing about the South particularly, I wonder, can you talk about, I'm interested in like how you approach writing through and about the South, and if it is different at all from when writing about Philadelphia. And I want to talk about Move, and after we talk about that.
It is very different because in some ways, there's an imagined element to the South for me, and in both books, I think it's kind of been handled in that way. Like in Hattie, those characters had left the South and they were in the North, and all their kids, right? And it's of course, it's Hattie's book, but she's sort of being seen through all of her children, and they have these received notions about the South from their parents, which aren't real, right? Like Hattie hates it and is like, I'll never go back, it's horrible. Right. And then August has all of this nostalgia. So neither of these are actual things. Like they're not real, they're received ideas. And then of course Bonaparte is kind of it is an extant place in the book, but it is also a myth, right? Like it's a spiritual homeland. Yeah. It's kind of mythological. It's sort of, so I think I've always sort of approached it through that lens. And I think also, there's this notion that, and I think I've been pushing against it in both books, which is that, people leave the South because then it'll be better in the North, and they've just left it behind,
Right.
And obviously that's not true, right? And so this notion of both the North as a promised land, that is a place to which one escapes from this horrible southernness, right? That's a completely false narrative. So I think a lot of the work is kind of trying to push against that. Like, well, that's not true. And I think the other part of it is that there's no way to understand any of these characters in their northernness without thinking about their southernness. Right. Like it's just not possible in the context of the United States. So that it has to be there. Otherwise, it ends up being very, very partial.
Right. And I think what your book affirms and maybe reaffirms for some folks is that even conversations, be they analytical, sociological, political, about what we know of Move, actually need a Southern connection to them, which if you really push, you can find that in some books. But I'm interested in, like, can we talk about the way the South moves in the book and what Move as an actual historic terrorist occasion, like how that influenced like how you wrote around that.
So how do I start?
And maybe I don't know if they know what the Move bombings are.
Oh yeah. So if people don't know what Move is, so Move was a black separatist group that existed in Philadelphia, mostly from kind of the late 60s-ish. They still exist now. And they composted, they were vegans, they were very interested in like a black utopic autonomy. And they lived in various sort of neighborhoods throughout the city at various points. They had kind of compounds in various places. The last place that they lived was basically in the neighborhood that is in the book. The group that forms ARC is not Move, and it's important for me to say that because because that legacy is very much alive and is very much a raw wound in the city of Philadelphia. So it's not Move, but it is sort of a lot of questions about Move in a certain way. So in any case, the real group Move, they had various armed standoffs with the police through the years. The final one that they got into was on Mother's Day in 1985. And on Mother's Day in 1985, they ended up in something like a 13 or 14-hour armed standoff with the police. There were 11 people inside. There was a row house. They sort of made it into a compound. And at the end of this standoff, the police and the mayor at the time, fascinating, the first black mayor of the city of Philadelphia, this is in 1985, what they decide to do to end this armed standoff is to drop a C4 explosive on the roof of this house. Everyone in the house died. Everyone but 2 people in the house died, 5 of whom were children. So this happened. I was 13, I guess, when that happened. Mm-hmm. So it has never, and I'm from Philadelphia, as we've talked about. So it sort of never left my left my mind. And so this book is, in some ways, is a lot of questions about how that happened, why that happened, why attempts at some sort of, and this gets to your point about the South, why this sort of attempt for Black people of some sort of autonomy or some kind of way of living outside, both of like racist threat, but also just sort of outside of the whole general capitalist thing. Like, well, what if we grow our own food? And what if we, these kinds of questions that I think are relevant to many, many people. Now, if we try to do that, why is that always met with outsized police violence? Right. And so, which is a similar thing that happens in Bonaparte at a certain point in its history. It is met with outsized police violence. And so in some ways, these places are kind of, they're like mirrors of each other, like what happens in Bonaparte, which is a much more successful community than the one in Philadelphia. It lasts for a lot longer. Its roots are deeper. It has more space, at a certain point they have 10,000 acres. So they can do all this stuff and they can farm and they can really keep themselves going for, a good 100 years, whereas the other community arc doesn't last nearly so long. But yeah, I mean, they're both attempts to sort of ask questions about that kind of state violence and police violence, and also other kinds of questions like what threats might they have internally? But you know what I mean? Like which personalities don't mesh with other personalities? Which people are really dreadful? Like which people are snitches? Like who's a threat to what? And then also like economic concern, like how do you feed yourself? Like, how do you keep the lights on? Like where did the lights come from? Was the electricity, all these kinds of questions about building a community. But back to your question, they really are, I think, kind of mirrors of one another, one much less successful than the other.
Yeah, and I want, I'm from Mississippi, and for different reasons, I carry it on my back. Like I want to rep it hardcore, especially when I'm up here. But Philly pride is a different thing.
Yes, it's
very what I'm saying? It's a different. Is
anybody from Philly here?
Layered thing.
She knows.
Yeah. And Black Philly to me feels like the most southern northeastern city. It's so Black Philly.
But it's like more stank.
It's so southern.
But it's very stank.
But it's so stank.
It's like Boston stank.
They so mean. It's like Mississippi if we didn't have no manners, right? and no space. That's what it is, right?
It really is.
But like, and this is some shit.
And snooty, really like.
But how you gonna be mean, stank, and snooty?
It's amazing. It's our superpower as a city. Mean, stank, and snooty.
I was in a cab one time, like driving back to some hotel, and it was real slow. And this woman was riding this bike, so you're going as slow as her. Fam, and people, I'm talking about of all races, all genders, like we're just going hard at this woman, like it was Trump or some shit. And I'm just like, she's just driving a bike, fam. But Philly, I'm interested in, and this is like a disrespectful question to Philly, but like everything we just described in your art. That's why I always want to claim you as a deeply Southern writer. I don't feel the stank, the mean, like, why? How did you rid yourself of that? and is fiction the only place we see it?
I would say no. I'm a lovely person. If my wife's out there, she'd probably be like, oh. I don't know. She's very much from Philadelphia.
Right.
I don't know. You know, I mean, I think in this book, it's true. There's not that much super mean stank. They're just
not Philly based.
Not a kind of Philly mean stank. There's not. I feel like in Hattie there was. Oh yeah. Like it was, you know, because these were like my mother's people, right? Like they are dirt poor, but super middle class aspirin and light skinned. Sure. And so they just really did think they were better than everybody else except the people who were more light skinned. And I'm like, well, you know, so they really, you know, it was a whole, you know, but and they were like insular, and they were also just like amazing. I mean, they were sort of astoundingly themselves, like faults and all. And I guess I don't think that that's there in this book, but I do think probably what's there is this sense, which is a sense that I think that I grew up with, that comes out much more strongly in Hattie, but a sense of a kind of like proud insularity. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like or a sense of people who are like, this is the world that I inhabit proudly. Yeah. You can think of it what you want. You can understand it. You cannot understand it. That's not my concern. Yeah. But like, and maybe it's a small world, or maybe it's a very particular world, but I inhabit it and it is mine, fiercely so. And so I think that's probably what remains of the Philly snobby stank, whatever, in this book.
Did you have you read The Street by Anne? Yeah. So I want to teach both of these novels together. I haven't, obviously, because this one just came out. But I'm also really interested in the way, or I'm interested in your interest in, when we talked a bit about the shelter and the interiority, but the way you also, in this book, I think, do a little bit more with like the outside world, like people moving through space, describing that space, moving these particular bodies through outside space. Can you talk about the importance of moving Black bodies through outside space, as opposed to like interior, you know, spaces that are apartments, shelters, whatnot? Can we just talk about that in this book?
Yeah. I think it was, this is going to sound completely ridiculous, but you know, I mean, to kind of sort of paraphrase Toni Morrison, like Blackness is the default humanity to me. So it's like I forget. I'm like, oh right, these are Black people. So then when they go outside, something different happens. Right. So it's also like I have to remind myself. I'm like, okay, yeah, she's got to go to the courthouse, you know, and see what happens there. So it's partially, it sounds really ridiculous, but in part it's like I forget that the world deals differently with them, even though when they're sort of in spaces that are not quite safe, but certainly spaces that are not public, I guess, right? They're kind of doing their own thing, and but certainly the forces from the outside world are pressing them and squeezing them, but they're also outside. You know, they're outside. Yeah. And so it becomes necessary for them and for me, as the writer or creator of them in some ways, I guess, to remind all of us of what happens outside. Definitely. And so we go outside and some things happen and then we come back.
That's a great answer. They told me I have to ask y'all wonderful questions when this thing says 40. So it says 40. I ain't got no mics, so if you have any questions for Ayana, please let us know. And if you don't, I have a lot of other things I could say. But questions, comments?
I don't have a question, but I really want to thank you for asking her such very good questions.
I know, right? Kiese is amazing. They were really great questions. She said she didn't have a question, but she wanted to thank you for asking me such good questions.
Thank you. That's really kind. That's super kind. Keep going. I'll keep going if. Hey, I know that dude.
I love what you said about whoever needs to speak speaks. And I wonder if you, if there's a certain practice you have for like the freedom of receiving the voices that are speaking versus like a fear of too many voices coming at one time. How did you learn how to lean into the freedom of?
I think, you know, the first book was a kind of a good training ground in a way because it was necessarily it's 12 11 I don't remember it anymore.
12.
There's a lot of them. And so necessarily like all of these people had to speak, right? Just by the nature of its structure. And what I found was that was a good place for me, right? That it gave me a lot of freedom. And so it sort of set a good precedent sort of for me as a writer, right? And it helped me to learn a few things. And then of course you come to this book and every book is totally different. So this book I'm like floundering for 800 years and I don't know what I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. Which sounds like I'm making a joke, but is actually true. And so, but the one thing I suppose that sort of carried over was that I did have this sense that I like a lot of voices. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing is maybe, you can hear, I think, sometimes really early on, you may not know what to do with a voice. And I think that's part of the process too, is like, maybe I don't know what to do with a voice, but if a voice comes and it's clear and it's compelling, like I'm interested in it. Like Duchess, I was just like, well, you're an interesting woman with a lot to say. Or there's a character named Miss Simmons who's a really she's snooty Philly Stank.
Oh, definitely.
There she is.
Yeah,
there is some. I forgot about her.
Yeah.
Who is a social worker in the shelter, and she was in her Philly snooty classes stank, but also kind of savior complex. Right. I just thought she was fascinating. So, and again, I didn't necessarily know what to do with her, but she sort of came around and so I guess the learning part is maybe a little bit of trust that, okay, well, I don't know where this goes or what it goes to, but it appeared, so I'll just kind of keep it around until maybe I find some use for it, or maybe I won't find any use for it and then I won't use it at all. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's like so much of it is just intuition, I think, like and slowly learning how to overcome your own fear and skepticism of your intuition, which I have not learned, but like little by little, I get a little less skeptical and afraid of my intuitions, like a little bit. But then I'll start another book and I'll be completely terrified again. So,
Hi.
Hi.
You said something about like a long writing process. I think you said 8 years, and like a particular idea came in like your 6th year. So that seems like pretty like late in the game, like at least in my head. I was thinking. My question, I guess, is your year one idea, like the idea that started the whole thing. Like, how protective of you were you maybe throughout the later years of that year one idea, or like what responsibility did you feel towards that idea as it like shifted and changed over time?
That's an excellent question. Who are you?
What's your name?
Who is this?
That's a good ass question.
It really was, right?
My name is Najee.
Hi.
Fareed. Hi.
I'm so
Kiese
glad.
and I are very impressed.
I'm so glad your name is
we're-
Najee too. I would have been side with like Lance. I would have been side. I would have me, not you. I would have.
So year one idea was a completely different notion. I mean, it was so long ago and it's so different that I don't remember it anymore. And it wasn't so much a process of being like, that's a bad idea. As I kept trying to write into year one idea, it kept receding further and further. Like the analogy maybe that I could make is that I feel like writing is always sort of like bumbling around in a very dark room. But I think the test is whether you can keep going, right? So I get in the dark room and I'm feeling around and knocking my shins and like cursing and crying and the whole kind of business, right? But at some point there might be like a tiny opening in a door or a window, like something that I can keep going and get to the next room. And that's how I know something might be viable, right? If I can keep going, if I can get to the next room, however badly I get there, which is usually in those early drafts, of course, very, very badly. but then I know it's not viable if I can't get out. Like, I cannot get out of here. I cannot continue. There is no way forward. And so over time, if I keep running into, like with year one idea, there's no way forward, there's no way forward, there's no way forward, then that begins to get edged out by something else that maybe there is a little bit of a way forward. And so then that year, it's almost like the year one idea gets diluted rather than, in the case of this book in any case, more than being just like jettisoned and thrown aside, it's like more stuff keeps sort of getting added that allows me to continue, and then that year one thing sort of recedes.
That's good, cuz. That's good. I'm sorry, that shit just good. What you want me to tell you?
Hi, it was a pleasure listening to you. But I was just wondering, overall, what were you trying to represent with these characters and their interactions?
Well, that's a hard question. I guess human beings moving around a landscape that is probably largely unfamiliar to many people, in some ways unfamiliar to myself, and how they navigate that landscape. Particularly human beings whose humanity would often be questioned in landscapes that would often lead to them being even further questioned. And so, yeah, I suppose in a way that's very vague, but yeah.
And I could just also say one thing you do. I mean, you know, I also just think what you do with like technology is so maybe subtle in this book, but there's a sentence.
I just think I'd only ignore technology. Is there technology?
Well, for me, the phone is still technology.
Oh yeah, that's true.
You know, and so
I love a phone call.
Yeah,
that's the truth. I do love a phone call.
And remember when there's just this beautiful line for me, because I just think about the restraint of it. Then she remembered she didn't need any change to call 911, right? And to me, that is not. I mean, that's about who and why, but it's also about like what technology does in terms of, you know, danger. And I think, you know, I think we all remember like, what the fuck, I ain't got no money, oh, just got zero. I remember being lonely as a kid and just trying to dial 411.
Me too.
I was the only child just to talk to somebody.
I'd call the weather.
You should call the weather.
And call the time and be like, I wonder what time it is.
Yes.
Like I'd be like, because I was like alone after school. So my mom was at work. I was by myself. I was like 8 and I was like kind of lonely. And I was like, I'll call the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes when you call, sometimes when us lonely kids talk to the operator, they would like do their jobs wrong and actually have a conversation. You know? Anyway, I just wanted to say I like the way you did that. Yeah.
Emily's also had her hand up forever. Sorry, we'll come back. I had to, you know.
Hi, Ayana.
Hi, Emily.
I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, I think not everybody knows that in addition to being a talented novelist, you're also a student, the Union Theological Seminary, although I believe you're taking a break right now to promote this book. And I wondered if you could just talk maybe a little bit, because I know you've also been a student of Marilyn Robinson, for whom divinity and theology are really important themes. Like, to what degree does that experience of being a divinity, like a student in seminary, influence this book? Like, does it come in at all? Also, because you've been writing for the New York Times a couple of wonderful essays about religion in fiction. How does that thinking inform this text?
I think so. I'm in divinity school because these questions have been pressing on me for quite some time. I think I grew up in a very, 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 very religious household. You know, church 3 times a week, etc. And at a certain point, you know, I left the church. I didn't want, you know. And then I tried to be an atheist because I like met like all these like cool middle class people, and and like all the cool middle class people didn't believe in God, and I was like, well, I don't either, even though I'm poor, but I have middle class ideas.
Wow.
And
That's so good.
So whatever. But it didn't really work out. And so these ideas about this sort of convictions about belief more than about God particularly. Like I think that I believe in God, but I don't know what God is and have decided that that's none of my concern. But what I think what I'm interested in is belief. Like what belief does to and for people. I mean, it is an absolute life force. It is for my mother. It was for my grandparents. Yeah. I think it probably is for me too in some kind of way. So I think in many ways there are, like, both books are sprinkled with like more explicit religious references, of course. I also should say that Emily, I know this is an aside, but Emily titled my book because she's a genius. So I just want to say that. Like in a text message, like in like a 6-minute text message exchange. I just needed to put that out there. In any case, right? So both books are, I think, sort of, actually there are quite a lot of religious references, explicit and non. Some of those come from studies, right? Or like there are conceptual things that kind of get brought in. But I think one of the biggest things is what I understand that religious belief does for people and the ways in which it acts on people, the ways in which it gives them something, certainly hope, certainly, all these kinds of things, but also life force, also access to love, also access to pathos, also access to things like supplication, to vulnerability, to helplessness, to weeping, particularly in Black communities where perhaps there are not other places that people feel that they can do that or are able to do that, to be weak. All of those things factor into the notion of belief for me, or how I understand belief. And I think that in this book in particular, all of these people are true believers. Yeah. And so that underpinning of sort of the divinity school and all these conceptual things, I think they come down to belief, and they come down to some expression of belief.
That's amazing.
And we have time for one more question from our live stream. From Seymour, your sentences are so beautiful. Can you talk about your relationship to sentences in the Unsettled? Do you have a way of detecting when language sings?
Oh, thank you, Seymour. And also, that's an amazing, I don't know why I'm yelling, like he'll heal me better. Thank you. And that's a beautiful question. I think, it's funny. I sometimes when I'm writing, I think, well, these sentences are just workhorses. They're just getting you from point A to point B. And I remember saying this to my editor. I was like, well, there's a lot of worker bee sentences. And she was like, what? And so I guess people don't feel that way. But so for me, often I feel like they're just like marching on through. They're doing their jobs. But I read aloud quite a lot. And I think you can always hear when a sentence is not happening by reading it aloud, right? It's like a weird process. Like it's very human. Like your voice will catch. It's almost instinctive. It's like when you hear a bad note in a song or something. Like you just stop. So that's often like a kind of a litmus test for me to see if I think a sentence is working or if it's not working. And then sometimes, I guess it's just like a nerdy writer thing. Like once in a while, you're just like, oh, that was a good sentence. I mean, nobody can tell me anything about that sentence. It doesn't happen that often, but sometimes it does.
Do you always keep those?
That's the kill your darlings thing. I try like hell to keep them.
Yeah.
But once in a while, sometimes it's like, well, this whole paragraph has to go because it doesn't have anything to do with anything. Yeah. And so goodbye that sentence. Right.
Thank you for just being super kind, but like one of the dopest motherfuckers ever. So, cause you don't have to be. You don't have to be. Thank y'all for making time for us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So amazing.
What are you talking about? Are they still? Is this shit on?
So the night isn't over yet because you can go buy the book and then go back by the cafe and grab a slice of cake because there's a special cake tonight to celebrate, and then get in line to get your book personalized. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you on the other side of this wall.